Hi everyone, welcome along. So this session is about managing difficult customers. By the end of the session, you'll be able to consider what constitutes a difficult and a dissatisfied customer, and the differences between the two. With regards to difficult customers, we're going to look at two particular components of what makes a difficult customer. We're going to look at interest and motivation. We're going to look at three types of difficult customer, and then tactics for managing those types of customers. We're going to look at a tool to diagnose the degrees of interest and motivation that customers have, and then we look at how this links back with other ideas that we've spoken about, and then the exercise at the end is to develop a plan for managing a difficult customer. So a question that I want you to consider up front is, what in your mind is the difference between a difficult and a dissatisfied customer, and what are the defining features of both? You may think about your own sales territory and consider an example for you of a dissatisfied customer and also an example of a dissatisfied customer. Now, what we find is that dissatisfaction often results from things such as people's expectations not having been met, from abruptness or rudeness, or lack of satisfaction with either the individual or the organisation or the product. It can result from customers not feeling like they're being listened to, or it can be due to failures in service, in warranty, or anything to do really with the product or service. So that's a dissatisfied customer. And really the key to managing those dissatisfied customers links back to many of the themes that we've already spoken about. So ideas such as being genuinely curious, offering challenging, noticing and managing yourself and others, agreeing goals, trying to add value, delivering on what you say you're going to do. Those are the kind of key attributes as to how you would manage a dissatisfied customer. But the area that I want to particularly look at is this idea of a difficult customer. And when we look at difficult customers, what we find is that there are effectively two variables which contribute to somebody being a difficult customer to work with. And by difficult, I mean that they are either not interested or not willing to move ahead with the support of our commercial objective. So the two variables are interest and motivation. So by interest, what really we're referring to here is a lack of shared interest in what your commercial agenda is. And by motivation, we mean that as a lack of willingness to commit to a sustained change as a result of working with you. Now, if you think about the language that we're using here around interest and motivation, and also you'll see on the flip chart behind me, what I've started to do is to put together this idea that these two variables can be assessed, and we can diagnose customers and their likely interest or motivation in what we're selling. Now, consider back to the role of stakeholder mapping, and that as a tool which we looked at earlier on in the program. And within that, we look again at interest, someone's willingness to be interested in what our commercial agenda is. And at that time, we also looked at power. In other words, their authority or their ability to affect the outcome of our agenda. Now, stakeholder mapping provides us with an early indication as to where you should focus your time and attention. So, for example, in the event that someone has low interest, but also has low power, in other words, they're not likely going to be able to affect the outcome, then we wouldn't want to dedicate a huge amount of time or resources to that particular person. However, if someone was low interest but high power, then there would be really good cause to want to try to develop their interest through time and through resources. So think back to your stakeholder mapping, think back to the way that we identify someone's likely power and their interest, and really the particular group of people that we're interested in here and looking to try to affect is those people who are high power but potentially at the moment are of low interest. Now, to consider the approaches for these difficult types of customers, so those who are lacking either interest or motivation or both, then we need some sort of test. And the test is based on their response to critical issues. So I want you to imagine that you are identifying and raising and highlighting a critical issue with a customer. The next step is to ask the question, what do you think about that? And to gauge their level of interest. And then the next question is to ask, what might you do in order to change that? And as a result of that, gauge their level of motivation. So let me give you an example. If I was working with a sales manager and I said to them the critical issue that I identified was that what we found during the course of research was that 80% of salespeople are unable to articulate what they do without describing features and benefits, and that be the critical issue. If my next question is, what do you think? And the response is, well, I don't really know, then we can gauge that as being a low level of interest. Conversely, if we make that point and ask the question, what do you think? And the response you get is along the lines of, well, it's really interesting that you should mention that. We found a similar proportion of people are unable to do that within our organisation as well. And in actual fact, we start to look at how we identify those competencies required in order to make that change. Then we could assess that person has a high level of interest. The next question we want to ask is, what might you do about that? So again, if we ask them what they might do and they say, you know what, it's just not a priority and it's not something we're actively looking at, then we would gauge that as a low level of motivation. Conversely, if we ask them the question, what might you now do? And the answer that we get is along the lines of, again, really interesting that you mentioned that. We've started to put together a core group of people who are going to look at how we take our Salesforce development forward in order to ensure that people can have these types of conversations. Then you would assess a high level of motivation. So by identifying the critical issue, which is point number one, and then asking the question, what do you think? You're able to gauge a level of interest. By asking the question, what might you do? You're able to gauge a level of motivation. And then having done that, you're then able to determine in which quadrant of our motivation and interest map where that customer sits. So if they're in the bottom right hand corner, so high interest but low motivation, we would describe these people as idle allies. And so in this area, they're lacking purpose and they're lacking motivation, but they may well be our friends. So these people will often be the types of customers that we might gravitate to. If they're in the bottom left-hand corner, people who are lacking interest but also lacking motivation, then these are what we've described as apathetic blockers. And they don't show any particular interest or feeling or enthusiasm or concern for either the agenda or the willingness to change. And then finally, in the top left-hand corner, we have what we described as skeptical challengers. And these are people who are maybe not necessarily convinced and might have doubts and reservations, but are those who are the most likely able to affect their change and work with them in order to develop their levels of interest so that we might work with them. So I want you just to consider those two questions and the link back to this idea of critical issues, which is, again, why this is so important. If we can identify the critical issue and raise it with a potential customer and ask them the question, what do you think about it? It gives us a sense of their interest. If we ask them, what might you do about it? It gives us a sense for their motivation. Now, with regards to developing interest, then it hinges really on the critical issue. And it requires us to go through the methodology that we've looked at, which is that we anchor the current state, we explore the future state, we look at the gap or the tension which exists, and then we support with our case stories and our evidence. And in doing so, we can likely affect someone's interest in a positive manner. With regards to their motivation, what we know from the previous work that we've done is there are 4 ways in which we can increase someone's positive intrinsic motivation. And that is by developing their sense of autonomy, mastery, connection, and meaning. So in terms of tactics for change and to try to develop each of these people, if someone is the idle ally, so they're in the bottom right hand corner, then we need to find ways to potentially develop their positive intrinsic motivation. So looking at things like education events, forums, peer-to-peer groups, peer-to-peer learning, visitation centres, getting them involved with the broader array of people from the organisation, doing things that allow them to develop that autonomy, mastery, purpose and sense of team or connection. If people are in the bottom left hand corner, so they're the apathetic blockers, then we're needing to do those things in order to develop motivation, but we also need to consider how we might develop their interest. And we do that by identifying their critical issue and exploring current and future states before supporting with evidence as to how we've helped other customers in a similar position. And finally, for those people who are the skeptical challengers in the top left hand corner of the chart, then these are the people where we're having to develop their interest, and we do that by developing their interest around critical issues, and shifting them from left to right on this chart as a result of identifying the gap that exists between the current and future state and how we can potentially help them. One final thought for you on this, which is that depending on somebody's behavioural style, then the way in which we adapt our message to them is going to be incredibly important. And so, as a reminder of the behavioural styles, we had drivers who were interested and had a primary need for results. We had expressives who had a basic need for recognition, amiables who had a basic need for relationships, and finally the analyticals who had a basic need for accuracy. And so just think, as you consider how you might articulate critical issues and a desire to want to develop somebody's motivation, that if you were working with somebody who was a driver and so was very results focused, then you'd want to look at outcomes and be quite deliberate and specific in the outcomes that they could expect. Whereas for analyticals, then you would want to be quite detailed and evidence-based and provide lots of facts and figures. If somebody was amiable and had a basic need for relationships, then you'd want to talk about the other people involved, potentially talk about their patients and the outcomes that they could expect. And then finally, for the expressives, then it would all be about profile and image and recognition and how it was a status thing for them, and they were likely going to be the first. So what I'd like you to do is to take a look at the workbook, take a look at the slides, and then identify a problem customer, a difficult customer, where you believe that the component parts that need to be worked on are around interest and motivation. And then consider some of the ideas that we've spoken about and how you therefore might develop a tactical plan to both increase their levels of interest in working with us, but also increase their levels of motivation. And as a result of that, you can put in place a touch system or a plan to develop your relationship with them. I'd welcome any questions or comments or thoughts on this. If you want to email anything through, you're very welcome. I'm happy to take questions either via email or on the phone. But in summary, there's two main categories of customers that we need to consider: the difficult customer and the dissatisfied customer. And what we've spoken about in detail is the difficult customer, where that difficulty arises due to a variance in interest and motivation. And within the 2x2, where we plot interest and motivation, we have the skeptical challengers, the apathetic blockers, and the idle allies. And there's a simple test to determine where people sit on that matrix. We identify the critical issue, we ask them what do you think to gauge their level of interest, and then what might you do to gauge their level of motivation. But depending on where the person sits against this matrix, then a plan is required in order to ensure that we develop either interest and or motivation. And finally, we've linked back to the idea of behavioural styles and the impact that has on how we deliver our message. So make something happen, have a go at the exercise, and commit to doing something out there in the field. Good luck.